And so, because she's familiar with him and what he does and how he likes to keep his room and don't bother none of his medicines and all that stuff. He's very particular about all this stuff,
Yeah.
And so, I think it'll work out, yeah. So, but otherwise, somebody called me up this morning and said, well, why don't you have somebody come at night to be there with them and help? She said, Mama, not gonna let anybody come here at night. People that are strangers and with so many strange things happening now, you have to be careful who you let in your house. So, we manage.
Well, let's open with prayer. Lord, we thank you for this new day, and we thank you for the chance to be together, to continue to study your word. And we ask, Lord, that you would give us wisdom as we continue to talk about the book of Ezekiel. Help us, Lord, to have discernment and to, even in strange chapters like chapter 23, to understand your word to us and give us your peace. So we ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. Okay, last week we started on Ezekiel 23, and this week we'll end it. It's in some ways a lot like Ezekiel 16. It's a very dramatic chapter. And last week we talked quite a bit about empire and this early line about these two. It's a parable about these two women who are sisters. I'll just start reading it, and we'll. The word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, there were two women, daughters of the same mother. They became prostitutes in Egypt, engaging in prostitution from their youth. And we talked a lot about how that plays in terms of the imagery last week. In that land, their breasts were fondled and their virgin bosoms caressed. The older was named Oholah, and her sister was named Oholibah. They were mine, and they gave birth to sons and daughters. Oholah is Samaria, and Oholibah is Jerusalem. Oholah engaged in prostitution while she was still mine, and she lusted after her lovers, the Assyrians, warriors clothed in blue, governors and commanders, all of them handsome young men and mounted horsemen. She gave herself as a prostitute to all the elite of the Assyrians, and defiled herself with all the idols of everyone she lusted after. She did not give up the prostitution she began in Egypt, when during her youth men slept with her, caressed her virgin bosom, and poured their lust on her. Therefore I delivered her into the hands of her lovers, the Assyrians, for whom she lusted. They stripped her naked, took away her sons and daughters, and killed her with the sword. She became a byword among women, and punishment was inflicted on her. Okay, let's pause there and do a little bit of recap of what we talked about last week. Now, this is in a sense an extended parable. What is, if you remember last week, and I know remembering a week ago is always fuzzy, but I'll try to refresh your memories. What is... So in an extended parable, you could say that in some ways this is a little bit... let me ask you a question. What's the difference between a parable and an allegory? Hard question, isn't it?
Yes.
Oh, well, let's start with simple things. Give me an example of a parable. Story, okay. Jesus tells lots of parables. In fact, the Bible is filled with lots of parables. Well, what's a metaphor?
Something in place of something else that means something else.
Okay. Can you be a little more specific? Give me an example of a metaphor.
Darkest night. That's a simile.
It's a simile.
Darker than the night sky. No, that's still a simile.
We use metaphors all the time. Well, here's a metaphor we began talking about this morning. Marty is cheering for the Eagles because they're the underdog. Now underdog Where do you think that word comes from? If you have multiple dogs, you understand it.
The
one not strong.
One not so strong. I used to have 2 Rottweilers, a brother and sister. And if they were together, I got into the pack practice. We had a couple little kennels for them. They liked their kennels. And I would often feed them in their kennels, because if I feed them together, what would happen?
one would get all of it.
The male would eat first, and there his sister would sit and wait and wait. Because she would get what? That's right. Whatever he didn't want. And so often I would feed him separately, because then she could eat first and I could basically control their portions. Otherwise, he would eat everything and she'd get the leftovers. Hence the word underdog. The underdog is the dog that doesn't have a chance, because in terms of the pecking order, the hierarchy, the dog is underneath, and the dog knows this, and her brother would regularly remind her of her place. Okay. Now Marty is going to cheer for the Eagles because they are the underdog. Now there are no dogs on the Philadelphia Eagles. What do you mean by that, Marty?
There are no dogs on the which day?
Well, there's no dogs on the Philadelphia Eagles. Why do you call them underdogs?
Well, because I see it on the other side. The Patriots have won 3 out of the last 5 years, or 4 out of the last 5 years, and they don't need to win again. That's something else win.
Exactly. So,
Don't expect them to win.
what's that?
Most people don't expect them to win.
Yeah, the Eagles have a really good team. It's gonna be a good game. It's gonna be fun to watch. But we say that the Eagles are the underdogs, and so we're going to root for them. Now that's a metaphor that they're underdogs, because they're not literally dogs. But we say it and we don't even think about it. So that's a metaphor. Okay, so a metaphor is usually a point of comparison, one thing to another. And a simile gets a little bit more literal, because we have the word as or like. So a metaphor is just this convention that we assume. Okay, what's a parable? Jesus tells lots of
Earthly
parables.
story with a heavenly meaning.
Okay.
Well, that's what you learn as a kid.
That's right. That's right. But there are parables that are not in the Bible. What's a parable?
Oh, the fox and the grapes, Aesop.
Okay, Aesop had a lot of parables. And so the parable, usually a parable has one point. And that's, whereas an allegory usually is an attempt to have multiple connections. So a parable is usually more like a metaphor, because it's supposed to have one point. It might have 2 or 3, but it's supposed to be kind of limited. Whereas an allegory is usually kind of an extended story that has multiple relationships. So let me ask you this question. From what we've read so far in chapter 23, do you think it's an allegory or a parable?
You know what, Paul? I was reading a commentary on Sunday.
Yeah. Oh, the class keeps going out to the commentaries.
7 pages.
So
Yeah, on chapter 12.
What commentary did you see, by the
You
way?
can ask me that, because I didn't write it down.
Oh.
Probably, God, who's the popular guy? I don't remember. But yeah.
Well, what did you get from the 7 pages?
Well, it's more like a metaphor.
Okay. Which is a little more along the lines of the parable thing.
Yeah, either a parable or metaphor.
Limited points of contact, one overall point. How many of you ever heard of Pilgrim's Progress? Okay. And what's Pilgrim's Progress?
It's a book.
It's a book.
A story.
It's a story.
In the book.
And it's an allegory.
Okay.
Because if you read the story, there's Pilgrim is the Christian. And so the pilgrim has all kinds of different adventures, and all of these different adventures are supposed to be in story form, connect with all kinds of things in life. And it's an allegory. And one of the interesting things about Tolkien and Lewis is Tolkien hated allegory. And so when people read Lord of the Rings or watch Lord of the Rings,
What is it?
they always try to turn it into an allegory. Tolkien hated allegory because he said, this is bad literature. So I suppose he didn't like Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which is a kind of a Christian classic, but a lot of people read it and they just kind of get the sense of, well, this is cheap. Because this is this, and this is this, and this is this, and people look at it and say, that's never quite that simple. So often people prefer parables. Okay. So we have this story, and it's a very graphic story about two sisters. And it's not, this isn't hidden. We know who these two sisters are. Who are they?
Ohola and Oholibah.
Aholah and Aholibah, Samaria and Jerusalem. Why are they called sisters?
Orthodox profession, let's say that.
Well, but the connection is deeper, right? They have the same mother. Who's their, or they have the same father. Who's their father?
Abraham.
Oh yeah, Abraham, Jacob. Now again, we talked a little bit last time about why are they female. Now we're getting into stuff here.
Does that have to do with them being in the hands of the empires, and they were submissive to the empires at that time?
Well, let's think. Now there's male and female, and there's masculine and feminine. What's the difference between these categories?
The feminine can give birth.
Okay.
No, the female can give birth.
Well, that which is, in that sense, why the female is feminine. Can men have feminine qualities? Sure. Can females have masculine qualities?
Yes.
Sure. So we have this idea of masculine and feminine, and this is a really hot topic right now in terms of culture. But these categories have been recognized for many cultures. So let's focus first on this line. Why would we differentiate male from masculine and female from feminine?
Something a male has that a female doesn't have, and vice versa.
There's an aspect.
Physiology.
These are really abstractions from these, right?
Those have to do a lot with the physical attributes.
So if we talk about generalizations, usually abstractions deal with generalizations, okay? Generalizations between men and women, obviously reproduction, nurturing, tend to be the females do a lot of that. When you talk about male and female traits, often you'll draw curves like this. Well, what do those curves mean? It means that, say these are men and these are women. If you look at physical strength, who is generally speaking stronger?
Male.
Men. And so, generally speaking, men are stronger than women. Can you find some women that are stronger than some men?
Yeah.
Sure.
Which is where you get into this range. Okay. Let's talk nurturing. Generally speaking, are women more nurturing than men? Yes. Can you find men that are more can you find a man that is more nurturing than a specific woman? Yes. So in a sense, there are these abstractions from the sexes. So let's talk about this range over here as sex. And let's talk about this as gender. And it's a little complicated because actually this word gender, see, words move. And probably 100 years ago, we wouldn't use this word for this category. What would we use this word gender for 100 years ago?
Male.
Language. See, part of the issue is in English, one person made the observation that a lot of these gender wars are going on mostly in the English-speaking world. Now you might say, well, that's kind of interesting.
Well, in French, there's male and female nouns.
Yes, there are.
And in English, there's male, female, and it.
Well, there's barely gender in the English language. One of the first things you do if you study French or Spanish, say in high school, is you get into this idea that language has gender. Well, guess what? Greek and Latin have gender too. Most languages have, or many languages have gender. Most of the languages in the West have gender. English doesn't have it much at all. We have it in terms of pronouns, but we don't have it in terms of most nouns. Whereas in French and Spanish and Latin and Greek actually has masculine, feminine, and neuter. So 100 years ago, when we talk gender, we'd be talking language, not people. Now, so this is a relatively recent change in our conversation. But sex has been around. Sex is male-female. That's biological. We understand that. Gender is an abstraction, and it's social or cultural. Okay. So everybody have kind of a pretty clear understanding of the differentiation between male and female versus masculine, feminine in terms of an abstraction. You walk into a room, go to any college, let's say I blindfold you and I bring you into a random dorm room and I take off the blindfold. How many seconds would it take you to probably identify whether a boy or a girl lives in that room?
No more than 5.
1 or 2 seconds, probably. In fact, if I don't cover your nose, you can probably smell the difference.
Yeah, with the blindfold.
With the blindfold on. I mean, now, there's a chance, depending on the given person, that I could fool you. Because again, this is the way this works. There are some men who are more feminine than some women. And there are some women who are more masculine than some men, but generally speaking, there's a distribution here. So over time and throughout history, there have been a sense of masculine and a sense of feminine. So now I get back to the question I originally asked. So we're going to represent Samaria and Jerusalem, and in the purposes of this parable, let's say, Samaria and Jerusalem are represented as feminine, as women. Now, it's very interesting because when we talked about empire last week, a lot of this story has everything to do with empire here, chapter 23. So Samaria and Jerusalem are women, and they're lusting after who?
Egypt, Assyria, Babylon.
Egypt, Assyria, Babylon. So who is taking the masculine form here?
The empire.
The empires. So the empires are masculine. why are the empires masculine and why are these two cities feminine?
Because of the strength of the empire.
Ah, what's the difference between an empire and a kingdom?
Kingdom usually has one king, one head.
Right.
An empire has many.
That's right. This term King of Kings or Lord of Lords, that is an imperial term. Herod was the king of Judea around the time of the 1st century. Caesar was King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Why did Caesar have that title?
He was the head honcho.
That's right. He decided he made kings. He said he made Herod king. Well, why did he make Herod king? Maury knows. Maury knows a lot of that history. Why did Caesar make Herod king?
It's always nicer to rule through some vessel that speaks the language of the people you're ruling over.
That's exactly right. So Herod is from the area. He's got the network. He knows the people. And so if Caesar wants to adequately and peacefully control that region, he wants to find a local guy. Well, why did he pick Herod rather than some guy named John or, because there were thousands of them? Why did he pick Herod?
He was a proven strong.
Or he could control, or was he a Roman?
No, it's actually an Edomite background.
Yeah. He was an Edomite. So he wasn't, so why Herod? Any guesses?
He had a lot of control.
How does well, let me ask you this question. Right after there's a presidential election, there's a long line of people by the White House.
Relatives?
Relatives sometimes.
They're looking for a job.
They're looking for a job. And so let's say you're the King of Kings, you're the Emperor. You're going to look for someone. What qualities are you going to look for?
They have the same quality as you do.
Okay, you want some alignment. You want them to be loyal. You probably are going to need to know them. So somewhere in your network, maybe it's someone that you do know, because then, this is basically how networks work. And so, emperors pick people that they kind of know, people with a track record of loyalty, people they can control, people that will be predictable. That's what you look for in a vassal. Okay? And that's how these systems work. Now, okay, so the emperor is masculine, and these two cities are feminine. Now the point here in the parable, because there are other parables in which Samaria and Jerusalem are masculine. Okay? And Samaria and Jerusalem are not always shown as feminine. But now this gets important into the long conversation of Israel. And actually, this gets specific in a number of places in the prophets, but it gets really clear in the book of Revelation. Because, let's look at the language. Samaria and Jerusalem are women who are prostitutes, and now let's say a single woman is a prostitute. Well, that can certainly happen, but that's a dramatic story. Nobody wants a daughter who is a prostitute. Why?
She's tainted. She's not shame.
See, and then now we're getting into all kinds of issues. Because, society, it's very interesting. I was reading, there was an article in the Miami Herald that was talking about, now women are starting to complain about the Me Too movement. What's the Me Too movement? Well, women who are saying, I was sexually harassed, I was sexually assaulted, I was sexually abused by a man in power, and so you had all these Hollywood revelations. Okay. And you've got all these, right now in the state capitol, all these allegations, these men are getting called out, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now the thing is, we live in a system where there's push and push back. So there's all these accusations, so now who's scared? this whole movement is sweeping, and I mean, you can lose your job because there's no court of law in a lot of these things. This is the court of public opinion. So somebody makes an allegation, you could lose your job. So what are men starting to do?
They're scared.
Men are scared. And so this is what, Mike Pence is kind of famous for this. But a lot of the men in the Florida state legislature are starting to say, I'm not going to meet with women lobbyists or reporters one-on-one behind closed doors. What are some of the women feeling about this now? Well, yeah, they're being frustrated.
Well, it's harder to do their job.
It's harder for them to do their job. And the men are saying, yeah, but
They're trying to protect themselves.
I'm protecting myself. So, well, how do I get out of this?
We're talking about masculine and feminine.
We're talking about masculine and feminine. Okay, so the context here is prostitution. And a difficult story is if someone would come to me and say to me, Pastor, I'm really troubled because my daughter is prostituting herself. And I would say, yeah, that's a real problem. But suppose someone came to me and said, Pastor, I'm really troubled because my wife is selling herself for money. What's the difference between a daughter doing this and a wife doing this? The wife, it's betrayal. The wife is betraying a trust. Now, in this story here, there goes my marker. In this story here, what's the story? What's the implied story here? Because you'll notice how many times the word adulteress gets picked up in this chapter.
Samaria and Jerusalem are being unfaithful to God.
Okay, so where does that locate God in this picture? Well, yes. But in terms of masculine and feminine? Masculine. Now again, and I have to run through this a little bit. Does God have sex? Now we just differentiate sex from gender. Does God have sex? No. God is not male or female. And we know this. Here's a question. Why in the Bible is God usually portrayed? Not always. There are some exceptions in the Bible. Why is God usually portrayed as masculine?
The characteristics and the culture.
Characteristics, culture. I think some of that too. But I think it's fundamentally relational. And I think the relational is right here. In this story, God is masculine. Why?
I think because the empires are masculine, portrayed as masculine, and we need to see that God is powerful over them.
Yes, but also how, again, if you think, why is Samaria and Jerusalem feminine and the empire's masculine in this story?
Doesn't it have to do with power
It does have to do with power.
and relationship?
In relationship. And the masculine and the feminine traditionally play what role in relationships? And in fact, the more we get into, say, gender equality, the more this actually gets highlighted. Let me ask you this question. Why, this is a very big question right now, why are so many companies run by men?
Well, years ago, women weren't, maybe in the sweatshops, but women weren't or in industry. Mama was home.
Nurturing.
So here's part of what's complicated about this. Let's say you're a guy, and you're ambitious, and you want to rise to the top of whatever group or industry you're within. What do you have to do to get to the top?
Push away the weak.
Push away the weak.
Work hard.
Work hard. Now, you need to be smart. You need to be industrious. And let's say if you want to get to the top of the NBA. Now, you're probably going to have to be born with some of the characteristics you need, but you're going to have to spend hours and hours. And if one guy is working 40 hours a week and you're working 50 hours a week, is that an advantage? So a bunch of people are working 40 hours, a bunch of people are working 50 hours, and the ones who are working 50 hours have an advantage over those working 40 hours, but so now you're at the level of everybody working 50 hours, what do? 60. I mean, this is what it takes to climb the ladder, right? And let's say you started, your education in this career at, say, 20 years old. And if you're working 40, 50, 60, 70 hours, and it's not only something that you want to do because you're ambitious, but it's something you like to do, well, if you've done all of this work and now you're 60 years old, you've had 40 years of working 70 plus hours a week. Boy, you're really, really good. And you know a lot. And when it comes time for someone to look around and say, we want someone to head this, what do they look for? Experience, smarts, and probably along the way you've built a network. I mean, this isn't just, and I haven't talked gender here at all. I mean, this is true for men and women. Okay. Now, if you're a man, generally speaking, you can do this. And, well, let's say you want to have a family. Well, what are the consequences of wanting to have a family if you're a man in this?
You're not going to be around much.
Get a good wife.
Well, that's right. You're not going to be around much.
You're not going to do much of the child care,
Raising your children.
And how's that probably going to shake out in the relationship? What's the wife going to think about that?
Not happen.
Not happy. So generally speaking, if you decide this is really how you want to spend your life, you're probably not going to do really well in relationships. Some men wind up doing okay, but there's compromises along the way.
You have to find someone that's opposite.
Yeah. Or you just decide you're not going to get married and you're not going to have children. That you're going to make your career your life. Now, women can do this too. But here's the thing. Let's say a man between 20 and 50 does this. And by the age of 50, he changes his mind. Says,
Then he gets a 25-year-old wife.
yes! That is exactly what happens. That is exactly what happens. There's a really interesting video about the guy who founded iCupid. And he said, well, shoot, with this, which is a dating website where people look for partners. And, because the internet's all kind of anonymous, but it's not really anonymous if you're running the data. And he says, here's the funny thing about men and women. Men, from ages 20 to 60, when it comes to just kind of base sexual attractiveness, what's kind of the age they're looking at? 20s. Women, when they are looking for partners, what are they looking at?
Older than themselves.
People their own age or a little older. All along the way. Men and women are looking for different things. So if you're a man and you're climbing the corporate ladder, probably by the age of 50, you got a bunch of money. You've got probably a successful career. You can plateau here at 50. You might not hit the tippy top, but you've probably gotten pretty high, so you can kind of plateau. And then you just, what's that? Or retire, and then you decide, I'd like a woman, I'd like a family. Can you do that at 50?
Sure.
If you're a woman, can you do this?
No.
You can't do it.
Usually.
Not usually. Why not?
Child protection for one.
Well,
Yeah.
when are the most reproductively fertile ages for women?
Teenage boy.
That's right! 13 to 35.
God didn't make that very fair.
No. There it is. Well, there's a biological reason for this. What is it?
Well, you're more productive at those.
Well,
The eggs start dying.
how hard is it on a man's body to father a child? Not at all. How hard is it on a woman's body to mother a child?
Very hard.
Boy, you have a child when you're 50. Good luck. If you manage it, if there aren't birth defects,
And then you got another 20 years.
then you got another 20 years. That's exactly right.
And the energy.
And you don't have the energy. Well, this 50-year-old, 50 to 70, well, you might be on kind of the low side of wrestling with the kid and stuff, which you really needs. But for a man, you're bringing in the money. So masculine and feminine. Okay, back to our conversation here. Samaria and Jerusalem and empire and God. Why in the story are they feminine and why is this side masculine?
Creator. We're supposed to
It's
find
who is
Jesus.
in control.
We're supposed to find Jesus in this.
Yes. Well, why in the book of Revelation? This gets clearest in the book of Revelation, which is very interesting, because it's implicit in the Old Testament many times. Now, there's so much stuff in the Old Testament prophets. Sometimes Jerusalem is male, sometimes Samaria is male. The prophets tell the story in lots of different ways. But when it comes to the New Testament, who is the bride of Christ? What does that mean? How does that play out here? Feminine and masculine. Because of this kind of image of, let's get into the book of Ephesians. Paul says, now the Romans got this, because the Roman paterfamilia, you had the father. Generally speaking, in the Roman Empire, in the Western Roman Empire, there wasn't a lot of polygamy. There could be. You had the wife, you had sons, you had daughters-in-law, you had children, but the father's kind of on top. Paul writes to the Christians in Ephesus and says, submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, what?
Submit to your husband.
Submit to your husbands. Oh, okay. There's actually not a lot terribly countercultural about that. Why he has to make that point in Ephesus is a much longer conversation about what's going on in Ephesus. What does he say to the fathers?
Love your wives.
Love your wives. Okay. Now, in our culture, we hear that. We don't bat an eye. Why? How do marriages start in our culture? Love. Falling in love. Now, when we think love, we think romance. Part of the difficulty we have in English is that in English, we have one word, love. In Greek, they were 4 words for our one English word. What would that lead us to suspect about our English word love?
It could be 4 different aspects.
It could be at least 4 different things, at least. So, and in English right now, how long has marriage been predominantly about romantic love in the Western world? Anybody know?
About 100 years.
100 years.
Romeo and Juliet.
Well, that's a really vital point, Lily. That marriage and romantic love have never been disconnected. And you can read it all the way back to Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? Why does he want to marry Rachel?
He loved her.
Loved her.
Beautiful, loved her. Who does he?
He gets Leah.
He gets Leah, and he's not happy, but he lives with her. And then the whole story then is this struggle between Rachel and Leah. Leah feels unloved, but Leah is doing what?
Having children.
Bearing sons. She now has status. So there's these multiple status hierarchies that are going on. So Leah feels unloved, and so she has sons, but then how does Rachel then feel?
I'm thinking she doesn't have sons, she's jealous.
Left out. Now this is irony, and you get this at the beginning of the book of Samuel with Elkanah and Hannah, because, no, it's not Elkanah. Is it Elimelech? Oh, Elkanah, I think. Because, and he says to her, is not my love worth more than 7 sons? And what is her answer? No! Because here's the funny thing about romantic love. Boy, we're wandering all over the place this morning. Here's the funny thing about romantic love. When you fall in love, the process of falling in love basically means you don't care what anybody else thinks in the world. Only what your beloved thinks. That goes on a few years. And that diminishes. So now you start to think, yeah, Jacob loves me, but what does everyone else think of me? What's my status? You don't have any sons. You have no status. All the women at the well look down on you. The servant girls laugh at you. You know, Sarah and Hannah. Hagar. I mean, this is the way human society is. So, love, well, it's only been the last couple hundred years or 100 years really, that people would marry for love. Before then, what was marriage for?
Procreation.
It's not also,
Procreation, yes, but
It was business,
A business.
political.
certain kinds of procreation. Procreation within an economic, social sphere. Because you could have children with other women. Well, they got a label. What was their label? Bastard. Well, what does bastard mean? We have another word for it.
Out of marriage.
Illegitimate. Well, when is a person illegitimate? Even just take that word apart. Legitimate. Where does legitimate come from?
Law.
Legal.
Leg, law, lex, law, bastards. You have a wife to have heirs. Well, what are the difference between heirs and bastards?
Bastards have no right.
Bastards don't have rights. Heirs have rights. It's about property. It's about access. It's about power. It's about status. So, well, why the bride of Christ? That's the church. Then the New Testament says, so when in the New Testament, when it calls the church the bride of Christ, what is that bride? Masculine or feminine? Feminine. So that's one conversation. Another one, the New Testament says, when you're adopted by God, you become sons of God. Now, there's a big fight in biblical translation whether they should say sons of God or children of God. Why did people argue for children?
it includes a female.
Because you have men and women. Why did people argue for sons?
Traditionally, it was sons who were heirs.
Right. Because when you use the word son, you communicate this idea of heir. Now, are women... Go ahead, Lil.
And the son's name carry on the family history.
That's right. And so when you say sons, you're saying masculine. Okay? So when you say the church is the bride of Christ, then the church is feminine. When you say the church are the sons of God, then the church is masculine. See, the point is not, oh gosh, saying sons of God, that's excluding me because I'm a woman. No, we're not talking male and female. We're talking masculine and feminine within the drama of the story. The point is not your biological sex in the story. The point is the role you're playing within the frame of the story. Now, if you don't understand the frame of the story, you get offended because you're having a conversation about a different story. And you might say, okay, I can understand why you're getting offended because you're having a conversation about a different story. But let's talk about this story here and notice the role you play in this story. And so the role that the entire premise behind Ezekiel 23 is, what should the role of God be over Israel? And this gets icky for some people in the Old Testament because sometimes God is Israel's father. Sometimes God is Israel's husband. Sometimes God is Israel's wife. Well, not usually wife, usually mother. And again, if you think about it in terms of these stories, it makes sense. Now you say, well, I don't want to think about God that way. Oh, okay. But then you're not going to be able to access this story. And you're not going to be able to understand what this story is saying. So you've got this story, and it's a very graphic story. What's the point of the story?
If we read the chapter, would we get it?
Well, I think so. Especially, see what have I just spent the last half hour trying to enable you to do?
Distinguish masculine and feminine.
Right. Be able to read the story within the context it was meant to be understood. Because if you just jumped into chapter 23 and read the story, a bunch of things would jump out at you. You'd be offended. Why are Samaria and Jerusalem women? It's horrible. Why not men? Well, sometimes they're men. But you haven't been reading enough of the prophets to find those places. Well, why this story about graphic prostitution? What does God have against sex workers? The point isn't about sex workers. And then there's, oh my goodness, I mean, this story gets very graphic indeed. And goes on, and then it gets violent. I will direct my jealous anger against you, and they will deal with you in fury. They will cut off your noses and your ears, and those of you who are left will fall by the sword. Oh my goodness. That's verse 25. And we hear, what's the deal with cutting off noses and ears?
Can't hear, can't see.
Yeah, can't hear, can't see. Well, now, the reason that gets mentioned is because in the ancient world, that's what you would do to a servant who betrayed you. Now, the ancient world was very effective in doing what they did. Brutal, but effective. Now, if you saw a person, right now we have like a credit score or a reputation. But if you saw a person whose nose and ears were cut off, what would you know just that fast?
He wasn't loyal.
Wasn't loyal. You can't trust him. It's like, boy, that's effective. A lot more effective than a credit score. A lot more effective than a bad reputation. Because the face, in terms of human beings, our face is our identity. Well, what is this saying about Israel? Now, what's interesting is that God, who's the masculine, doesn't cut off the nose and ears. Who cuts off the nose and ears? The whole story says, and again, we talked about this before, Israel loses to Babylon. We expect Israel to then adopt the gods of Babylon. Israel changes the story. It takes forever to do it, where the Lord says, I sent Babylon to punish you. Well, how does that work out in this story? Who cuts off the nose and ears? And in what context does it do? Why did you get abused by Babylon? What is the story that Israel is told? So, I told the story last week. A girl comes home and says, I'm in love. Well, who are you in love with? Well, his name is, I don't know, Frank, and he's head of a motorcycle gang. What do mom and dad start thinking? Oh, crap. But I love Frank. Yeah, I'm sure you do. It's going on in mom and dad's head, and they can't stop her from sneaking out with Frank. And then at some point, they give up trying because they know they're failing. But what are they thinking in the back of their minds? Probably two things. Hope she comes to her senses. She's probably only going to come to her senses by really seeing who Frank is.
She's gonna suffer.
And she's going to suffer, and I hope she doesn't get hurt too bad. Those are two things the parents are thinking about. They're thinking about now, okay, you really want him? Well, then you start hearing phone calls. Well, Frank's been cheating on me. Oh, really? Why am I not surprised? I thought he loved me. Yeah, we were all young and naive once. And then you're thinking, and I'm pregnant. Oh, now there's a whole nother category, right? Because now you're going to be tied to Frank forever. So that's suddenly when abortion comes in, because abortion is a way to what?
Get rid of the problem.
Get rid of the problem. Well,
Both problems.
there's a scapegoat in a sense, because the baby becomes the scapegoat. You kill the baby, you cut the tie. It's a heavy price for the baby to pay. So, this is what this story is about. And God is saying, you wanted Babylon? You're like the daughter who wanted to go after the bad man, and the father couldn't stop her. And so now you're getting what you asked for. And then this chapter doesn't, at the end of this chapter, it ends with this common phrase that you hear again and again. Go all the way to the end of the chapter, verse 49. You will suffer the penalty for your lewdness and bear the consequences of your sins of idolatry. Then you will know that I am the sovereign Lord. You find that phrase repeated again and again and again in the book of Ezekiel. Now, unfortunately, many of the chapters that are like this, and there are many chapters like this in the book of Ezekiel, usually the way the story ends, it doesn't end, this chapter doesn't end that way, but often the way the story ends is the way it ends in chapter 16, where at the end of it, the Lord does what? Then I myself will come to you, and I will rescue you, and you will be my wife once more. And that gets even more shocking, because what would the people of a kingdom say if the king married a prostitute? That's right. Kings don't marry prostitutes. Why? They might sleep with prostitutes. Why don't they marry prostitutes?
They're below their status.
Why? What is necessary? What is a wife for in this picture? Heirs. Why wouldn't you want a prostitute bearing heirs?
Because you don't know that you're here.
Right. That's right. Because the key feature you're looking for is not only that, now again, there's no genetic testing back in the day. Not only that you know this child is yours, but everybody else needs to know that too. You don't want any question. Because once there's questions, what happens? Start challenging. You're not his real son. You're Lord Birmingham's son, not the king's son. And there's rumors about this. And because, kingdoms are incredibly complex social systems. But that's why chapter 23, that's why the story is the way it is. Now we read it and we say, oh, this is horrible. Why don't we pay attention to the culture and the place where the story was told and understand? Why can't we see beyond ourselves enough to say, oh, I understand the world this rises in. So we won't go into chapter 23 anymore next week. But hopefully if you go home and you read it, that's right. 8 pages of commentary.
And it was Matthew Henry.
Matthew Henry, yeah. 8 pages of commentary. Well, when you read the chapter now, maybe we'll begin to understand why God is so angry.
That's a really strong message.
Really strong message. And it actually translates through cultures quite well. Our culture's weird. It really is. But through most of human history, they'd read this passage, they'd understand it exactly right. We don't. We're weird. Western. Let's pray. We're out of time. Lord, the story is about us because we are the unfaithful wife, daughter, girlfriend, lover. And then we chase after empire and we chase after all the things that empire offers. And you are to be our husband. Help us, Lord, to be faithful to you. And be our husband, Lord. Love us, ravage us, keep us secure, keep us safe. May we love only you. Hear our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen.
Amen.